I'm going to finish off the material from last week, which I didn't really get round to, and try and do that in a reasonably speedy way, just to talk about the final kind of part of the evolution or the kind of shape shifting of Marvel into Marvel Studios. And then I've incorporated some of the stuff that I didn't get to do about what transmedia is, which I know some of you are interested in, touches on one of the essay questions. I've incorporated into a part of this lecture where it fits, because the main topic of today is audiences, which I've kind of split into two ways, and there's every chance that I'll have to sort of round this, finish off this session early next week as well, because as you can see there are 90 slides at the bottom, and I don't have much of a track record for getting through 90 slides in 3 hours. But first, looking at comics fandom. However, I want to start that with a general talk about fandom and present some ideas to you, some theoretical ideas that are more general around fandom, and also ask you what you understand by fandom, and indeed whether there are fanish behaviours that you undertake. And then towards the end, and probably very towards the end, we will start to look at, no problem, Keenan, we will start to look at that association, let's put it that way, that association between comics and children and young people, and we'll try to figure out whether we think that's accurate, justified, whether we think it's as true now as it used to be. And that will lead us into next week, where I'm going to look at the overall kind of notion and metaphor, really, that the comics industry and comics art grows and matures, which is quite a common thing that you'll see that says that comics mature or grow up, to the point where we have graphic novels in bookstores and things like that, and we have kind of more adult content. However, it's also slightly problematic, that metaphor, I would say. So let's go. So just to finish off the signposting this journey that Marvel was on from last week, how did Marvel Studios come to be from the mess of the mid-90s I described last week? If you remember, they went into bankruptcy. Marvel, as a publisher, went into bankruptcy in around 96. And that slogan there at the top, which was a publicity line, who can make Marvel products better than Marvel, kind of has a clue to the answer of how the company did get out of that mess. So until the mid-2000s, Marvel films, headed by a character who, if you do look into Marvel, you'll hear a lot about, called Avi Arad, who came from the toy business, and then came to Marvel and really took huge interest in increasing Marvel's exposure in media, particularly in feature films. So Marvel Films until then was a pre-production hub. It was just really a place where films could be set up. Marvel might speak to directors and writers and producers and things like that, and try to strike deals, which would then be taken to studios, and the studios would then license the characters. So, for instance, Fox licensed all the X-Men family characters. Lionsgate licensed the Punisher, for instance. At the time, this was a pure duplication strategy, trying to sort of build the links that would make Marvel have conglomerate kind of clout, a bit like DC Comics had at Warner's, but it could only be an attempt to sort of resemble those links, because Marvel did not have that kind of parent. Funnily enough, this kind of idea had been run through the company before. In the late 70s, Marvel wanted to purchase a modest production company so that it could bring things like cartoons, television, and film in-house. Stan Lee and the then parent company president, Jim Galton, tried to convince the overall parent at the time was a company called Cadence Industries, and sort of said, look, buy a small studio, then we can do all this in-house. We own the rights to most of these characters. We can make these productions ourselves, and then they'll look like we want them to look, and they'll be authentic to the characters. But they couldn't win that argument. So Marvel was denied moving to a controlled schedule of moving image production. They still wouldn't have got there ahead of DC's. DC was already owned by Warner's at the time, but the idea was there. They did succeed in buying an animation unit and starting to control much more of the activity in animation. So you actually get some very good, towards the end of the 80s and early 90s, you actually get some very high quality cartoons coming out. Even though they were sort of Saturday morning cartoons, they're pretty good quality, and a lot of those are on Disney Plus, like the X-Men cartoon, which a lot of people have a lot of fondness for, and one season of a Silver Surfer cartoon, which I watched over the summer actually on Disney Plus, and it's pretty good. When Avi Arad came on board and the licensing deals started to, you know, improve and increase with major studios to take some of the characters that Marvel thought, you know, were either tentpole characters like Spider-Man or might make a good movie character like Blade. The sums exchanged for the rights to these characters rose quickly because Blade in 1998 and the first X-Men film in 2000 obviously proved very successful. You know, Blade wasn't a very expensive film and did very well at the box office. X-Men was just sort of, you know, went straight into that kind of franchise level of success, albeit at the sort of middle kind of that sort of dollar amount. So Sony gave Marvel a $10 million down payment and a first dollar participation deal on Spider-Man, for instance, the film that became the Sam Raimi Spider-Man. First dollar participation deal means that when the studio does the accounting on all the money that comes in, Marvel, as the sort of source of the characters, was getting a slice of that from the very beginning, not just when the studio had kind of done all its financial wizardry on the money. Because when you'll have heard me mention this before, perhaps in another module, but when you get a net a royalty or kind of we call them points, you know, a net amount of money rather than a gross amount of money, it means that some sort of accounting has gone on to mean you have to wait until everybody else has been paid and the studio has kind of taken a huge share, and so you get paid. And this was different. So Marvel was getting more of a kind of a promise of a revenue stream from the picture if it was successful to go with that $10 million that it already had to pay for the licensing of the character. Some of the licenses, like the one that became Blade, were with New Line Pictures, which actually by then had been bought by Warner Brothers. So Blade was being, you know, shepherded along the kind of production line and eventually released by essentially by DC's parent company, which kind of shows you how even though the sums for licensing were getting bigger and Marvel was able to trumpet that they had a big hit with, you know, a relatively big hit with Blade, there was still relatively little control. Eventually, though, of course, the X-Men films built into a franchise. The second film was much bigger than the first film. The second film, I think, is 2003 or maybe 2002. Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 2002 was obviously a great success and just a, you know, a sort of a real sort of really knocked it out of the park in terms of blockbuster sort of size return. So Marvel decided to purify and concentrate on character, trying to tap into a credible mirror of the creative structure of a mini Disney that I mentioned on the previous slide. The deal for Fox's X-Men brought Kevin Feige into the fold, and he officially took position as second in command in 2000. So Feige and Arad are sort of teaming up as creative producers. But the really important appointment, a lot of people miss this in kind of thinking about the kind of history of Marvel Studios. The key appointment was a guy called David Maisel. Maisel was more of a commercial guy, behind the scenes guy who was involved in sort of moving the money around. He was more like Arad's business partner, Ike Perlmutter, who's presided over the organization, sort of chief financial officer, I think his title is, so sort of over the money side of the operation since Marvel came out from bankruptcy. And you may know that Perlmutter is a mysterious figure that is not often photographed, and when he is photographed, he's usually at a party thrown by Donald Trump, which sort of shows you the kind of big business world that he's from. Maisel joined as Marvel Studios president and chief operating officer in 2004, and Maisel is credited with pushing Marvel into the arena of independent production, for which we now recognize it for the first few films that did incredibly well in order to attract the Disney purchase. So the first two Iron Man films and The Incredible Hulk, which was not quite as big, but certainly those first two Iron Man films that showed that Marvel could really do, you know, you even have the seeds of the Avengers, of course, in those first two Iron Man films. So it was clear that Marvel meant business from those films. But without the $525 million from Wall Street, basically credit from Wall Street banks, that Maisel convinced various banks to hand over to enable Marvel to make those first three films, you know, they never would have been strong enough. They never would have appeared strong enough to be on Disney's radar to buy. So production was kickstarted. In 2005, Maisel ascended to vice chairman and executive vice president of corporate development in the wider Marvel Entertainment company. He's also credited with essentially brokering and making possible that 2009 deal, whereby Marvel, which had only been making its own films, you know, since 2008, although obviously it started on Iron Man a long time before that, was purchased by Disney for, I think, $4 billion. And after that, he left the company, Maisel, I'm presuming, with a very nice going away payment. Arad left in 2006, but you still see Avi Arad on some Marvel films because he stayed on as a producer and kind of was attached to certain franchises that meant that, you know, he was never involved in any of the kind of official Marvel Studios releases, but you would still see his name on some of the films that were being licensed to other studios like Punisher films and Daredevil and things like that. Since Maisel's exit, but still under Ike Perlmutter's sharp oversight, the studio business revolves around three leaders, each with some creative identity. I've mentioned Feige, who most people know, the president of production. Kevin Feige is the most visible of the three important kind of business leaders and production leaders at Marvel. He's the guy that always fronts the big Comic-Con presentations of what's coming up on the slate. The co-president, Louis D'Esposito, and the executive vice president of visual effects and post-production, Victoria Alonso, you see in the picture there with Gwyneth Paltrow. So one of the things that Marvel has done that has given it a great deal of stability is maintain this core team around these three executives from one production to the next. And with Alonso and D'Esposito both being, kind of in the upper echelon since 2009, you've now had the same team of three kind of head execs for 12 years, which is pretty good going for a volatile, realm like Hollywood. And they wear Marvel Studios governance with a light public front, often appearing in interviews, often appearing at conventions and fan events or speaking on behalf of Marvel at kind of Hollywood events, TED Talks and things like that, stressing a creative interest. They're often presented as creative executives. We don't always think of Hollywood. If you think of the kind of the typical way that a movie or television might represent a Hollywood exec, it's usually a fairly, Philistine kind of man in a suit, isn't it? But these guys wear an image that stresses creative interest and leadership while balanced out with, the executive sort of protecting of the company. So you get this idea of a stable team with a shared creative background at the heart of how the productions are assembled, and this is kind of meant to complement, I suppose, what we're more used to seeing as the influence on the final films and TV shows that get made in any kind of studio setup, which is directors, writers, and various crew. But it's worth noting that there's genuine consequence and power to the decisions that these three make, and of course, as we know, it's very possible for a director to come on board a Marvel film and then depart, even if they have quite a good track record, like Patty Jenkins on Thor or Edgar Wright on Ant-Man. The game-changing MCU started in film, but significant to its expansion was Marvel Television, established in 2010 after the sale to Disney, after which Disney moved its operations to ABC Studios, which is a network that Disney owns in America. Here, Jeff Loeb, another guy who's come from comics, from writing in comics, and I think maybe occasionally still does write comics, occupied a position that was a bit like Kevin Feige's, but overseeing the television wing, which at first aimed to increasingly feature in the world-building transmedia enterprise of the MCU. So did anybody watch Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D.? Has anybody got any kind of history with that program? It's now on Disney+, but it used to go out on Channel 4. And when that show started in 2013, it was begun by Joss Whedon. Yeah, I watched it all the way through to the slightly bitter end. It was a bit of a rough ride towards the end, but there was still some good stuff, actually, to be fair. I did enjoy the show. The first season has got the most obvious connections to what's going on in the MCU, and they did pull off one thing that I was quite impressed with, which you'll remember from the first season, which was that the week that Captain America: The Winter Soldier came out, they had kind of a spin-off story that was about the S.H.I.E.L.D. agents, kind of I can't remember if they were kind of saving people who were being threatened by those big Project Insight ships, or if it was that they took control of one of the ships or something like that. But there was quite a nice dovetailing into Captain America: The Winter Soldier, which actually came out the same, the week after the film had come out, which was a real time, kind of as if it was a real time link. Of course, that's incredibly difficult to do because of the length of time that goes into preparing films to come out. So they weren't able to do that very often. In fact, that's the only time I really kind of remember them doing that. And it got to the point where Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. was so detached from the movies that they the way they explained Thanos, for instance, was really, was really throwaway. You blink, you kind of blink and miss how they kind of referenced Thanos and the blip and stuff like that, because it was still going the show by the time that Endgame had come around. Anyway, Jeff Loeb oversaw this side of things, but still under the control of Perlmutter. Both of the divisions, the TV and film strategy, was back then monitored by a group that was meant to be a kind of brains trust involving leading comics pros, but also the necessary kind of Hollywood production wisdom. So people who were coming from experience, producers and direct and people who had on the ground experience of sort of setting up productions, very experienced kind of production and kind of heads of their departments from Hollywood, as well as leading comics professionals, particularly writers. And this was known as the Marvel Creative Committee. And it was meant to give a creative leadership and a kind of collegiality, a bit of a boardroom, but not a boardroom for, for sort of the balance sheet and the bottom line, but to discuss, what was right, what would work in this new kind of transmedia adventure, and indeed what would be appropriate for Marvel, what would not contradict what was going on in other parts of Marvel. But the MCC ceased to exist around 2015. All television, so after that, I think it becomes much more under the kind of personal guidance of Feige. Feige never liked being managed and oversaw by Ike Perlmutter, so I believe that when the first few years of Marvel under Disney, when Marvel had really been hitting it out of the park with every film making huge profits, I think Feige went to a guy called Alan Horn, or went to the top guy at Disney, whose name I've forgotten, and said, "Look, I just want to report to somebody at Disney, and that's it." And I believe that's how it works now. I believe he reports to Alan Horn, who I think is still head of entertainment at Disney, kind of content. All television at the moment is in-house via Disney Plus. The only show that I'm pretty sure is still being made that doesn't have a Marvel Studios logo on it, but just has a Marvel logo on it, which means it's not kind of being officially kind of counted within the Connected Up universe now, is perhaps understandably is an animated show called MODOK. Has anyone seen that on Disney Plus? I thought it was pretty hilarious. It's a kind of clay animation, Wallace and Gromit style show about a supervillain who does exist in the Marvel universe but hasn't appeared in the MCU yet. I really recommend it. It's really silly. I really enjoyed it, and it's but it isn't. It's for whatever reason it's not Marvel Studios, despite appearing on Disney Plus. All of the network shows, as you'll probably know, yeah, it's pretty daft, but it's well done and good writing. Patton Oswalt plays MODOK, and he's very good in everything really. But you probably know that the Netflix Marvel shows have finished. If you haven't watched any of those shows, Daredevil got a lot of critical acclaim, was very good at the beginning. I think The Punisher had its fans. I thought Jessica Jones, in terms of individual seasons, I thought the first season Jessica Jones was a brilliant season of television. And it maybe goes off the boil in the second and third seasons of Jessica Jones. But if you haven't seen any of those and you've still got Netflix, I really recommend the first season of Jessica Jones. She's a powered person who kind of had an attempted superhero career, but as she kind of hits her 20s, she kind of moves away from all of that and reinvents herself as a private detective in New York City. But she has this nemesis who's played by David Tennant called Kilgrave, who has this particular hold over her. So the first season is all about the battle to sort of free herself from this past trauma she's had at the hands of this man. And it's fantastic season of television, really is. Not easy going, it's quite heavy at times, but really worth going with. So Perlmutter and Feige kind of split apart. As I said, Feige specifically said, I don't want to be controlled by the New York side, which was Perlmutter, and the kind of the money side of the company. What we have got now, and it'll be interesting to see how long Feige stays at the top of Marvel. It's a bit like a football club that has a manager for 20 seasons. You've got like kind of a Feige era. I think there's probably, we didn't really do it so much in the book, but there's probably a book out there or a paper to be written about, you know, what a Feige kind of authorship influence over Marvel looks like, because he's been there at the top for so long, and really everything has sort of had to be approved by him. So whether it's James Gunn or formerly Joss Whedon or the Russos, or, you know, Chloe Zhao now with Eternals, that's sort of actually helming the individual films. And I do think there's a good indication that Marvel are willing to give individual directors more control now than they were 10 years ago, because the MCU has been set up with such success. You know, remember that it's not as much of a risk as it might seem getting Chloe Zhao to do the Eternals, because, I mean, first of all, she's just won the Oscar, so she's extremely, you know, her time. But second of all, a lot of the personnel around her will be sort of standard Marvel people. So Victoria Alonso will probably be exec producing on the film, and Desposito will be in there. A lot of the special effects houses and people who kind of lead the crews on things like that will have worked on previous Marvel productions. So there's a lot of kind of house style can be got from that. So I think that's why Marvel's a bit more emboldened to pick directors now who are maybe a little bit they're kind of coming from a different kind of side of things in terms of previous track record than maybe people like Joss Whedon were. It's going to be interesting anyway to sort of see how that Feige era concludes, and also you know, with Disney Plus now, a lot of you might be thinking about this already when you use Disney Plus, how Marvel kind of continues into that era. You know, now that we're starting to get used to films being released online almost simultaneously with their cinema release because of COVID, it seems that, and we've seen the kind of quality of a lot of the Disney Plus shows, and I imagine the same for you know, stuff over on HBO Max, that there could still be consequences for sort of how, you know, how the MCU shapes up. So let's try and bring this bit to a close. What is Marvel Studios? Johnson says media infrastructures themselves changed as a result of the institutional embrace of franchising. Tried to kick off last week talking about what franchises really are. We throw the word around a lot very easily, I think, don't we? So because of the institutional embrace of franchising, and this was an embrace not only by Disney and the brief independent Marvel Studios, of course, but by the industry as a whole, there was a clue there whereby the old form of Marvel Entertainment, which included Marvel films in it from the early 2000s, could be properly rebuilt. And it was rebuilt to the point where the $500 million was attained from Wall Street. First two Iron Man films and Incredible Hulk were actually released, and the other films up to 2009 went into pre-production. So obviously films that come out in 2011, like the first Captain America film, the first Thor film, were well underway by 2009, and that, you know, really proved that Marvel was serious this time. Hence the Disney purchase. And remember that Disney purchased not just, you know, the film company that was making the MCU, the television, you know, the kind of the media exploitation to all this stuff. They bought Marvel as a publisher as well. So Marvel Comics parent is, of course, Disney also. Marvel has partnered. I'm sorry that the text has come out so small on that slide. This Collaborate still managed to mess around with some of the slides. Marvel has worked with some fairly high-profile partners over that kind of 20 years since Avi Arad joined the company. The desire to control that exchange with partners and other institutions helped to feed the conglomeration process. So when Marvel was looking enviously at, say, Disney, or looking at DC and under Warner Brothers, it was having to reach out to sort of partners to help give it some of that kind of extra power that it didn't have when it was just a sort of a relatively newbie. You know, it was a comics company that was trying to throw its weight around in Hollywood and didn't really have any weight at that point. So it was trying to work with these other companies and sort of learn from them. So notably Activision in games, and of course Netflix in television. I think the discussions, you know, the deals to work with Netflix were no doubt signed after Disney takeover. But I think the idea of working with an outside agent to produce television was part of the kind of initial drive to create Marvel Studios. We didn't really have time to do a full screening last week, and I certainly won't have time today. But I do have some suggestions of things that you might have access to if you've got either Netflix or Disney Plus that you might want to watch, either to go a little bit more deeply if you have only seen MCU films, or if you haven't seen MCU films, maybe something that you could watch that might be a bit different, that maybe will be more up your street. So I've already mentioned Jessica Jones, the entire first season of which I think is really good. If you want to kind of get an idea of how the Netflix shows tried to almost like ape the Avengers, kind of bringing together of separate heroes after a number of introductions, then that show was The Defenders in Netflix.